There's a man in the One Piece world who's been standing at the edge of the story for almost as long as it's existed, and we still barely know a thing about him. He turns up in a storm, does something impossible, says something cryptic, and he's gone again before you've had a proper look at his face. Monkey D. Dragon. Luffy's father, if you want the headline, though that's probably the least interesting thing about him. One Piece has run for the better part of 30 years now, and in most of that time he's done little more than stand on a balcony somewhere, grinning, looking off toward the wind. So that's where we're spending tonight. Not racing anywhere, not building to a big reveal, just wandering slowly through everything the series has actually told us about Dragon, and getting comfortable in all the enormous gaps it hasn't. There's no finish line here. You can drift off whenever you like and miss nothing, because there's no payoff being saved for the end. It's a long, quiet ramble around one of the great question marks in the whole story. Settle in. Let's begin with the man himself. Let's start with the tattoo, because it's the first thing anyone notices, and there's a lovely little detail hidden in it that most people walk straight past. Dragon has this large red marking down the left side of his face. In the manga it's a bright sort of a arterial red. In the anime they went a shade darker. It reads like tribal line work, all sharp angles curling around his eye and cheek, and it gives him this permanently intimidating look even when he's doing nothing more threatening than reading a newspaper. And here's the thing I love about it. He didn't always have it. If you go back to how he looked at Gol D. Rogers' execution, a little over 2 decades before our story properly kicks off, his face is bare. No tattoo, no stubble, just a younger, blanker version of the same man. So somewhere in those intervening years, he sat down and got that put on his face deliberately, and we have no idea why, or what it means, or whether it means anything at all. It could be cultural, it could be personal, it could be pointing at something in his past we haven't been shown yet. Oda does that a lot. He'll plant a visual detail, and then let it sit there quietly for 15 years before it turns out to matter. So the tattoo just sits there, being mysterious, doing its job. The rest of him is built to match. Spiky black hair with a pronounced widow's peak. The kind of hairline that arrives in a room slightly before its owner does. After the time skip, it grew out a fair bit, long enough to spill down past his shoulders, which softened him a little, oddly. He's got a bit of stubble on the chin, a goatee that's more suggestion than statement, and if you look closely, no visible eyebrows, which shouldn't work on a face and yet completely does, and he's nearly always grinning. Not a warm grin, more the grin of someone who knows something you don't and is quietly enjoying that fact. On the rare occasions we've seen him not grinning, like at Roger's execution, it really lands as unsettling, because it's such a break from his default setting. Then there's the outfit. A long green cloak usually, worn over the orange garb of a revolutionary underneath. Practical, weathered, the coat of a man who spends a lot of time outdoors and near coastlines. There's something deliberately unglamorous about it. He's the most wanted man on the planet, and he dresses like he's about to go and inspect a fishing net. I find that quietly brilliant on Oda's part. No cape, no armour, no throne, just a bloke in a big coat who happens to terrify the entire world government. Now the trivia, because there's a fair bit of it tucked away in the various data books, and I find this stuff quite soothing to go through. Dragon is 55 years old. His birthday is the 5th of October, which makes him a Libra, for anyone keeping track of that sort of thing. He stands at 256 centimetres, which is 8'5" in old money. So he is an absolute unit of a man, towering over most of the cast. He was born in the Goa Kingdom, which is going to become relevant later in a couple of different ways. So tuck that away. And his blood type, if you care, is listed as F, which in the One Piece world is its own little coded system Oda uses. His bounty? Unknown. Just unknown. Blank. For the leader of the single largest threat to the world government, the man they've openly branded the world's worst criminal, we have never once been shown a number. And honestly, that blank space is doing more work than any number could. A figure, however enormous, would be something you could measure him against. The absence of one just says, we're not even going to try to quantify this. Make of that what you will. Here's the fun detail I promised though, the one people miss. There's this running visual motif across the whole monkey family, 3 generations of them, and it's all on the same side of the face. Garp, Dragon's father, the great marine hero, has a scar on the left side of his face. Luffy, Dragon's son, famously has that scar under his left eye, the one he gave himself with a knife as a kid, to prove he was tough. And Dragon, sitting right in the middle of that lineage, has his tattoo, left side of the face, every time. Now, is that Oda telling us something profound about bloodline and destiny, and the mark this family carries? Or is it just a nice bit of visual shorthand, so you clock immediately that these 3 are related? I honestly can't tell. Could be both. It usually is with him. But once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And I think that's rather the point. And then there's the letter, the D monkey, D dragon. That middle initial that keeps turning up all over this story, in the names of people who have absolutely no reason to be connected. Gold D Roger, Monkey D Luffy, Portgas D Ace, Marshall D Teach. It's referred to, when it's referred to at all, as the Will of D, and it is one of the oldest and most carefully protected mysteries in the entire series. People who carry that initial tend to be freedom-loving, fate-touched, and a specific kind of trouble for the people in charge. Dragon has it. His father has it, so it runs in the blood. His son has it. I'll pick that whole tangle of what it might mean back up later on, because it deserves its own proper sit-down, and I don't want to rush it here. For now, it's enough to notice that he's a D, and that being a D seems to come with a certain gravitational pull toward the centre of everything that matters. So that's the man on paper. Enormous, tattooed, grinning, cloaked, unmeasured, and carrying a letter in his name that the world government would very much prefer didn't exist. Which is a lot of intrigue for someone who, when you actually tally up his screen time across all these years of story, has barely been in it. And that gap between how important he obviously is and how little we've been allowed to see is the whole reason a video like this can exist. He's a silhouette we keep filling in a pixel at a time. But talking a bit about how little he's been in it. The first time we ever properly laid eyes on him, he wasn't named, wasn't explained, and was gone again within a couple of pages. He just turned up in the rain, did something impossible, said something cryptic and vanished. And for a long, long time after that, that scene was more or less all we had. So let's go there next, because it's where the whole mystery started. Logue Town, the town where the Pirate King was born, and years later, executed. The Straw Hats stopped there to stock up before the Grand Line, and it's meant to be a quick supply run, and it turns into the moment the whole story quietly tips on its axis, though nobody watching for the first time could possibly know that yet. Luffy, being Luffy, ends up on the execution platform. Buggy the Clown has got him up there, sword raised, the whole town watching, and it's one of the tensest little sequences in the early series because at this point, you don't fully trust that Oda won't do something mad. Zoro and Sanji are fighting their way through the crowd and they're not going to make it, and Luffy, tied up, grinning, apologising to his friends that this looks like the end, is completely at peace with it, which is very him. And then a bolt of lightning comes down, out of a sky that a moment ago was clear, hits the platform, destroys the whole scaffold, and Luffy walks away without a scratch. Sword gone, ropes gone, buggy flattened, not a mark on him. It's the kind of thing you'd call a plot convenience if it happened in a lesser story. Here it's the first brushstroke of something much larger, because the storm doesn't stop there. Luffy, Zoro and Sanji are legging it out of town toward the ship, and Smoker, the marine captain who has never once let a pirate leave his town, catches Luffy and pins him to the ground. And this is where the man in the cloak actually steps into frame. He's been walking the streets this whole time, As the weather turned, this tall figure nobody's paying attention to, and he stops, and he watches Smoker holding his son down, and he says, more or less to himself, that Luffy becoming the Pirate King would be fine by him. And then an enormous gust of wind comes out of nowhere, tears the Marines off their feet, scatters the whole scene, and Luffy is free again. Smoker looks at him, recognizes him clearly, is visibly rattled, which for Smoker is saying something, and Dragon just watches the Straw Hat sail off into the storm and tells his son, at a distance the boy can't hear, to go and make his dream happen. Then he turns to Smoker and asks him quite calmly what possible reason a man could have for trying to stop another man from setting out to sea. And that's it. That's the scene. He's introduced, he changes everything, and he leaves. Now here's the detail that has kept fans arguing pleasantly for the better part of 20 years, and it's a lovely little rabbit hole. Did he do it? Did Dragon actually summon that wind and that lightning? Or did he just happen to be standing there when a real storm rolled through? Because the answer really depends on which version of the scene you read, and that's not an accident. In the original Japanese, when the gust hits, the Marines are shouting something that translates most naturally as just a squall, a reaction, weather happening to them, not weather being done to them. And crucially, Dragon's mouth is shut the whole time. He's not calling out an attack, he's just there. But then you get the various translations layering their own assumptions on top. The old 4Kids dub, which butchered a lot of things, more or less had him confirm he caused it, gave him this line about not having helped Luffy yet, made it explicit. The Viz manga translated one line as Wind Blast, phrased like a named technique, as if he'd just fired off a move. So depending entirely on where you first met this scene, you either walked away certain he's a weather god, or quite unsure whether anything supernatural happened at all. And I think that ambiguity is deliberate, and I think it's kind of masterful. Oda planted a man at the centre of a storm, and then refused, absolutely refused, to tell us whether the man and the storm had anything to do with each other. All these years later, he still hasn't told us. We'll dig into the whole weather question properly later on, because there's a bit more evidence to lay out, and a rather fun theory attached to it. But this is where it starts. A closed mouth, a scattered squad of Marines, and a question that never got answered. What gets me about all of this, looking back, is how early it is. This isn't some late series reveal. Dragon shows up around volume 12, roughly 50 episodes into a show that's now well past 1,000. He turns up in the 1990s. He's one of the oldest loose threads in the entire tapestry. Oda knew, that early, that this man was Luffy's father, that he led the revolution, that he'd matter enormously at the end. And he showed him to us anyway, right there at the start, disguised as a one-scene mystery man, and then made us wait the better part of a lifetime to understand what we'd seen. There's something a bit audacious about that as a piece of storytelling. Most writers wouldn't dare introduce their endgame character in the first act and then more or less shelve him, but that's the confidence of the whole project, really. Dragon in Loguetown is a promise. A note struck early that you don't understand until the rest of the melody catches up to it. And for the longest time, that scene really was almost the whole of him. A cloaked figure, a storm, a cryptic blessing to a son who didn't know his own father was standing feet away. The Straw Hats sail off. Nami had even clocked the storm coming on her instruments before any of it happened, and the story rolls onto the Grand Line and forgets about the man in the rain for ages. Luffy doesn't even register that anything unusual happened. He just knows he got lucky. It would be years of story time before anyone told us that the mysterious man had a name, and that the name was one Luffy shared. And when that reveal finally came, it didn't come gently. It came in the middle of the worst day of Luffy's life, shouted across a battlefield by an admiral as a weapon. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, and there's no hurry. Since we've touched on the fact that Dragon is Luffy's father, though, let's actually sit with the family for a while, because it's one of the stranger family trees in fiction, and the more you look at it, the odder it gets. 3 generations of the monkey family, and every single one of them ended up on a different side of the law. Now, I don't think there's another family in the story quite like it for sheer internal contradiction. At the top, you've got Garp, Monkey D. Garp, the marine hero, the man famous enough that entire arcs bend around his reputation. He's the one who cornered Goldie Roger. He's the one the Navy trots out as the living proof that their side produces legends. A vice admiral who by rights should have been made an admiral several times over and kept turning it down because he didn't fancy taking orders that close to the top. Garp is the establishment. He is on paper everything the world government wants a man to be. Then his son grows up to become the most wanted criminal on the planet and the founder of the one organisation dedicated to tearing that same government down to the ground. And then his grandson becomes a pirate. You can just picture the family dinners. Actually, you can't, because they almost never happened, which is sort of the whole tragedy of it. Garp raised Luffy, or attempted to, in his own catastrophic way, throwing the boy into ravines and leaving him in forests full of wild animals because he'd decided that was how you build a strong marine. It did not produce a strong marine, it produced Luffy. But the point is, Garp was around for Luffy. Dragon wasn't. Dragon handed his infant son over to his own father in a village in the East Blue, and then walked back out into the world to go and do the thing he'd decided he had to do, and that was more or less that. We don't know the circumstances, we don't know what the handover looked like, or what was said, or whether anything was said. We just know that at some point roughly 19 years before the current story, Dragon left a baby with Garp and left. And the choice to have Garp raise him of all people is fascinating, because Garp and Dragon do not get on. Garp was, by all accounts, furious and heartbroken that his son turned revolutionary. He'd given his life to the Marines, and his boy grew up to declare war on everything the Marines protect. That's not a small disagreement, that's a wound. And yet Dragon still trusted him with the one person who mattered most. Says something that. I'm not sure exactly what, but something. The relationship between Garp and Dragon is one of those things the story keeps almost showing us and then pulling back from. We know it's strained. We know Garp took Dragon's decision hard. But we've never seen the two of them properly in a room together, hashing it out. It's another of those deliberate blanks. You get the shape of the estrangement without any of the detail, and your imagination fills the rest. Now, the moment the world found out who Dragon's son was, this is important, and it only gets explained properly once, so I'll do it here, and we can just nod to it later. For most of the series, Dragon being Luffy's father was a secret, a tightly held one. Even inside the Revolutionary Army, almost nobody knew. But at the Summit War of Marineford, the enormous battle where the Navy executed Luffy's brother Ace in front of the entire world, Sengoku, the fleet admiral at the time, stood up and announced it, broadcast it, essentially, to every corner of the world, that Luffy, this rookie pirate causing chaos on their doorstep, was the son of Dragon the Revolutionary and the grandson of Garp the hero. He said it as a kind of weapon. This bloodline is a threat. Look at what this family produces. Look at the danger sitting right in front of you. And in one sentence, a secret that had been kept for the better part of 20 years was just gone. What I find quietly heartbreaking about that whole thing is Luffy's own reaction to his father, across the series generally. Because there's this moment earlier on when Luffy reads about the Revolutionary Army being in danger, and he barely reacts to the bit about Dragon. It's his sworn brother Sabo he's frantic about, once he knows Sabo's involved. His actual father, the man who saved his life in Logue Town, mostly registers as an abstraction, a name, someone other people are impressed or frightened by, and you can't even blame Luffy for that. because the man was never there. You can't miss what you never had. There's no bitterness in Luffy about it, no daddy issues, none of the usual. Just a sort of neutral blank where a father would normally go. And here's the detail that turns that from sad to something more complicated. Dragon, it turns out, did watch. Not closely, not constantly, but from a distance now and then over the years. Kuma, one of his closest people, noticed him doing it once. Caught the world's worst criminal quietly keeping an eye on a boy he'd left behind. So it's not that Dragon didn't care, it's that whatever he's doing, whatever he decided his life had to be about, he judged that it left no room for actually being a father. He chose the mission and kept the boy at arm's length and watched from the wings. Whether that was noble or cowardly or just necessary is one of those things the story leaves you to decide, and I honestly go back and forth on it depending on my mood. Which brings us, unavoidably, to the one enormous blank in this whole family. Luffy's mother. We have nothing. Almost the entire run of the series, and we still do not know who this woman is. Whether she's alive, whether she's dead, whether she ever knew her son, whether Dragon loved her or lost her or something else entirely. She has never appeared. She has never been named on the page in any confirmed way. For one of the most beloved characters in modern fiction, the identity of his mother is a total, deliberate, ongoing void. Fans, being fans, fill that void constantly. Every so often, a new candidate surfaces and the internet gets briefly excited. Fairly recently, there was a flurry about a Kuja woman glimpsed in a flashback, purely because she looked a bit like Luffy and the ages sort of lined up. And look, it's fun to speculate, and I'm not going to pretend I don't enjoy a good theory. But it is speculation, thin speculation at that, built on a family resemblance and some loose maths. Oda has kept this card so close to his chest for so long that I've half convinced myself he might never play it. It's entirely possible Luffy's mother is a character we'll never meet, a deliberate absence rather than a mystery with an answer. And honestly, I'd almost respect that more. So that's the family. A marine hero, a revolutionary, and a pirate, all sharing a name and a mark on the same side of their faces, mostly held apart by choices and distances nobody ever fully explains. It's a family defined by absence more than presence, by the rooms they weren't in together. But the thing Dragon chose over all of that, the mission he decided was worth handing his son to his estranged father and walking away for, is a whole world of its own. So let's leave the family for now and go and look at what he actually built. The Revolutionary Army didn't start as an army. That's the first thing worth knowing. It started smaller, quieter, under a plainer name. The Freedom Fighters. A little cluster of people who'd looked at the way the world was run and decided, individually, that they couldn't stomach it. And over time, that small thing grew into the single largest organised threat the world government has ever faced. Dragon built that. Not overnight, not with a grand founding moment, but gradually, gathering people, spreading an idea until one day the powers that be looked up and realised there was a genuine rival to their authority operating in the shadows of their own world. What separates the Revolutionary Army from every other faction in the story is the size of the goal. This is what I keep coming back to about Dragon, because it's properly radical even by the standards of a series full of ambitious people. Most rebels want a better deal. They want their king overthrown, their taxes lowered, their particular tyrant gone. Dragon doesn't want a better deal. Dragon wants the whole thing gone. The entire world government. The whole structure that sat at the top of this world for 800 years. And more specifically, he wants the celestial dragons, the world nobles, the so-called descendants of the world's founders, who swan around treating ordinary human beings as livestock, wiped out as a class. Not reformed, not humbled, gone. That's not a policy position, that's a demolition project on a global scale. And it tells you something about the depth of whatever he saw, whatever turned him, that nothing smaller would do. He's not trying to fix the house. He's decided the foundations are rotten, and the only honest thing to do is pull it down. We'll get to what he actually saw later, because it's a lot, and it explains the size of the ambition better than anything. The structure of the thing, then. At the top, Dragon, the Supreme Commander. The word they use carries real weight in the original. The sole highest authority, the founder, and the final say. And directly beneath him, his second, his chief of staff, the man they openly call the number 2 of the entire organisation. That's Sabo, and Sabo's a whole story in himself, one we'll properly get into, because his connection to Dragon and to Luffy is one of the quiet miracles of the plot. For now, just know that the command structure is basically Dragon at the peak and Sabo running the day-to-day beneath him, and that the two of them are as close as the mission allows anyone to be. Below them, the army spreads out across the world in a way that's rather clever. They don't fight the world government head-on, not usually, because that would be suicide. Instead, they work like water getting into cracks. They turn up in countries where the people are groaning under a bad king or a corrupt system, and they help. They train locals, they spread information, they nudge, they organise, and then quite often a government that stood for generations simply falls, and the revolutionary army melts away again before anyone can pin it down. Guerrilla work, essentially, seeding rebellion rather than staging invasions. By the time the world government notices a fire, it's already halfway across the region, and half the time they can't even prove Dragon's people started it, which is exactly why he's the world's worst criminal. Not because he's personally slaughtered anyone we know of. In fact, everything we've seen of Dragon suggests a man who cares a great deal about ordinary people getting hurt. He's the worst criminal because his crime is the biggest one imaginable in this world. He's trying to end the order itself. To the people at the top, a pirate stealing treasure is a nuisance. A man teaching entire nations that they don't have to accept being ruled is an existential threat. There's a real logic to the branding when you think about it from their side of the table. He's not the most violent man in the world. He's the most dangerous idea in the world, walking around in a green coat. And he treats it like a job, which I rather love. There's none of the theatrical villainy or grand speech-making you might expect from someone with a goal this enormous. From what we've seen, Dragon runs his organisation like a serious, slightly weary senior officer. He keeps himself relentlessly informed about what's happening in every corner of the world. He makes a point of educating his people about current affairs, actual briefings, because he wants them to understand the world they're trying to change, rather than just take orders. And he keeps telling them, over and over, that the big one is coming. The Great War with the world government. He talks about it the way you talk about a storm on the horizon that you can see, and they can't yet. It's coming. Prepare, the balance is going to shift. He's been saying it for years. And the further the story goes, the more it looks like he's right, and the closer that storm gets. The army had to have a home, of course, and for a long time that home was an island called Baltigo, a stark, grey, windswept place, which honestly suits him down to the ground. A headquarters that looks like the surface of a colder planet. That's where we saw him for a lot of the middle stretch of the story, standing on a balcony, reading reports, looking out at the weather. It felt permanent, the way a base does when you've seen it enough times. And then it wasn't. After the Dressrosa arc and revealed early in the Zoo arc, Baltigo was attacked and destroyed. Not by the Navy, interestingly, but by the Blackbeard pirates, who came looking for a fight and left the place in ruins. The army survived, they'd largely cleared out by the time the worst happened, but the loss of the base was a real jolt. It said, this organisation is not untouchable, and there are now players in the world big enough to come knocking on the revolution's front door. After that, they relocated, eventually basing a lot of their operation out of the Kamabaka Kingdom, which comes with its own colourful cast of characters that we'll meet in a moment. The thing I find really compelling about the Revolutionary Army, underneath all the intrigue, is that they're one of the few forces in the entire story with clean hands and a coherent moral case. Pirates are pirates, even the likeable ones. The Marines are compromised from top to bottom, serving a government most of them don't fully understand. And then there's this lot, quietly going around the world helping the powerless throw off the powerful, asking for nothing much in return, except the eventual chance to take a swing at the people at the very top. It's hard not to be a bit on their side, which is presumably exactly how the recruitment works. You start out sympathising, and one day you look up and you've joined. And a fair few of the people at the heart of that organisation aren't just dragon subordinates. They're the closest thing this profoundly private man has to a family. So let's talk about them, because the story of who stood next to Dragon while he built all this is, for my money, some of the warmest material in the whole series. Kuma's a good place to start, because his story is the one that's broken the most hearts recently, and because his bond with Dragon is the quiet spine of the whole revolutionary army. Bartholomew Kuma came from the Sorbet Kingdom, and he is, underneath the enormous frame and the eventual blank-faced tragedy of what the world did to him, one of the gentlest characters Oda has ever written. A man of deep faith, deeper kindness, and a life that just kept asking more of him than anyone should have to give. He became one of Dragon's earliest and most trusted people. And here's the detail that tells you everything about the level of trust between them. Kuma was one of the people who knew that Dragon was Luffy's father before the world found out. Not Ivankov, who'd been with Dragon for years and served under him. Not anyone else except Garp. Kuma was among those who knew Dragon was Luffy's father before the world learned it. Dragon told him, or Kuma worked it out, and Dragon let him keep it, and Kuma carried that secret quietly for years. That's not a small thing to hand another person. That's the most private fact in your life, and you gave it to exactly one man. And Kuma honoured it in the way he honoured everything, completely and without fuss. There's a stretch where Kuma quietly saves some of the army's people during a mission and then vanishes again without a word of explanation, and Dragon's response is simply to tell his soldiers not to chase after him, that his old friend clearly has his reasons. No demand for answers, no wounded pride, just trust, extended even when the man's behaviour made no obvious sense. Because Dragon knew Kuma, and it turns out Kuma had reasons that would eventually break your heart, but Dragon giving him that grace, that benefit of the doubt in the moment, is one of the more moving small beats in the whole saga. Then there's Ivankov, who is about as tonally opposite to Dragon as a person could be, and somehow it works perfectly. Eva is the ruler of the Kamabaka kingdom, an enormous, theatrical, gloriously over-the-top presence, a queen in the fullest sense, with the power to manipulate hormones and bodies in ways the story uses for everything from healing to comedy to genuine tactical madness. And beneath all the flamboyance, Ivankov is fiercely, unshakably loyal to Dragon. The clearest proof of that comes at the worst possible time. When Luffy tears through Impel Down, the great underwater prison, and later through the war at Marineford, it's Ivankov who steps in to protect him, who keeps Dragon's son alive through the meat grinder. And the thing is, at that point, Eva didn't even know Luffy was Dragon's son. He protected him partly because Luffy was Luffy, and partly out of pure loyalty to the cause. It was only afterward, when the family connection came out, that Ivankov got to be delighted about it, and Dragon got to be quietly, deeply grateful that his friend had shielded the boy without ever knowing why it mattered so much. There's a lovely bit of texture there too, in that after the secret was out, Dragon gently drew a line with Ivankov, told him more or less not to go digging into his personal life. And the read on that isn't distrust, it's a father, even an absent one, pulling a curtain close to protect his son. Keep him out of it. Don't make him a target through me. It's about the most fatherly thing we've ever seen Dragon do, and it's phrased as a boundary between old comrades. And then there's Ginny, who I don't think gets talked about enough, and whose story ties this whole circle together in a way that only became fully clear fairly recently. Ginny was part of the early revolutionary world, close to Kuma from childhood, and she rose to command one of the army's regional forces. She mattered to these people. She mattered enormously. And her life took a cruel turn, the details of which are quite upsetting. And when she was near the end, the will she left behind was about making sure her daughter was cared for, and she trusted that care to Kuma, and she spoke of Dragon and Ivankov as the people who could be relied upon. That's the measure of the man among his own. When someone at the very end of everything is deciding who in the whole world can be trusted with the person they love most, Dragon's name is on that short list. After Ginny was gone, the command she'd held, the position at the head of that regional army, was essentially retired out of respect, left as hers, with anyone wanting to take up a similar role having to go through Kuma. You don't do that for a colleague, you do that for family. The role did eventually pass to Bello Betty, who's a marvellous character in her own right, one of the army's senior commanders, with a power that literally draws the fighting spirit and courage up out of ordinary people and turns a frightened crowd into a force, which is, when you think about it, the perfect ability for a revolutionary. She doesn't fight the people's battles for them, she makes them able to fight their own. That's the whole philosophy of the organisation, rendered as a single devil fruit, and I think it's a beautiful bit of design. What strikes me, laying all these people out side by side, is how unlike a criminal empire this all feels. There's no fear holding it together, no ambition-fueled backstabbing, none of the usual rot you'd expect at the top of an organisation this powerful. It's held together by loyalty and old friendship, and a shared sense that the world is broken and worth breaking your life over to fix. Dragon inspires that. This intensely private, closed-off, rarely seen man has somehow built a core of people who would, quite plainly, die for each other and for him. And the way he holds them, the trust he extends, the grace he gives when their behaviour doesn't add up, the quiet lines he draws to protect the vulnerable, tells you more about who he actually is than any of his cryptic one-liners ever could. You don't get loyalty like that by being frightening. You get it by being someone worth following. There's one member of this family, though, who came to Dragon differently from the rest. Not a co-founder, not an equal, but a half-drowned boy pulled out of the sea, who grew into the most important person in the army after Dragon himself, and who turned out, years later, to be bound to Dragon's own son by a bond older than either of them knew. So let's talk about Salbo. There's a boy in the Goa kingdom, roughly 12 years before our story starts, sitting beaten in an alleyway, having just discovered that the adults running his country are willing to burn a whole slum full of people alive to tidy up the place before an important visit. And he's crying, not out of fear, but out of a kind of furious heartbreak, because he's realised the world he was born into is rotten and the people in charge of it don't care. And a tall man in a cloak stops and listens to him. That's how Sabo meets Dragon. And I think it's one of the most quietly perfect character introductions in the whole series. Because of who the boy is, Sabo was born noble. His family were part of the upper crust of the Goa kingdom, the very class Dragon has devoted his life to destroying. And here's this noble child, weeping in an alley, because he's ashamed of his own people. Dragon later says, more or less, that it moved him, that a boy like Sabo being driven to despair by that corruption was exactly the sort of thing that proved the whole system needed to come down. The corruption in Goa he understood as the same disease he was fighting on a global scale, just shrunk down to one rotten little kingdom. Not long after, Sabo tries to escape it. He sets out to sea in a tiny homemade boat because anything is better than staying. And a world noble sailing through sees the little boat crossing his path and fires on it. Just fires on a child's boat for the crime of being in his way. Because that's what celestial dragons do, and it's the single cleanest illustration of why Dragon's mission exists. The boat is destroyed, Sabo goes into the water, and by every reasonable measure, he should have died right there, another nameless casualty of a noble's boredom. Dragon pulled him out, found the half-drowned boy in the wreckage and saved his life, and then raised him, took this child of the class he hated and made him a revolutionary, and not just any revolutionary, his best pupil, the one he clearly saw something special in from very early on. Sabo grew up inside the army, trained and shaped by it, and rose until he became the chief of staff, the number 2, the man we already talked about standing directly beneath Dragon in the whole organisation. That's a remarkable arc. Pulled dead from the sea as a child and grown into the second most important person in the most dangerous organisation on the planet. There's a cruel twist folded into all of this though, and it's the amnesia. The injury Sabo took when the noble's shot hit his boat cost him his memories. So the boy Dragon fished out of the water didn't remember his old life, didn't remember the 2 brothers he'd sworn himself to back on that island. He built a whole new self inside the Revolutionary Army, without knowing there were people out in the world grieving him, thinking he was dead. For years, Sabo didn't know who he'd been. And here's the part that really gets me. Dragon didn't know either. Dragon had no idea for the longest time that the brilliant young man he'd raised as his finest student was the sworn brother of his own biological son. The 2 most important young people in Dragon's entire life were bound together by a childhood promise, and the man at the centre of it all was completely oblivious. It was only fairly recently, in story terms, a couple of years before the current events, that the pieces came together and Sabo's memories and the family connections all surfaced. And when you step back and look at it, it's almost absurd how tightly Oda wove that knot. Roger finds a baby, Shanks, at an event we'll get to. Dragon leaves his own son with Garp. Dragon pulls a drowning noble boy from the sea. And it turns out the drowning boy and the abandoned son were brothers all along, sworn to each other over cups of Sakia's children, on the very island Dragon himself was born on. The coincidences pile up to a point where they stop feeling like coincidences and start feeling like the story quietly insisting that these lives were always going to knot together. Fate, if you want to use that word. And given the whole Will of D thread, the story rather does want you to use that word. Sabo's own journey eventually took him somewhere spectacular. He inherited a devil fruit, the flame power that had once belonged to Ace, Luffy's other sworn brother, the one who died at Marineford. So Sabo now carries Ace's fire, quite literally, which is the kind of emotional accounting that makes this series what it is. And he became a figure of real consequence in his own right. At the Reverie, the great gathering of the world's kings, Sabo and the Revolutionary Army made their boldest move yet. They went right into the heart of the enemy, the Holy Land where the celestial dragons live, and they struck at it, wrecked the food storage, defaced the great symbol of the celestial dragons, the sign of their 800 years of rule, which is about as public and humiliating a middle finger to the world order as anyone has ever managed. And they moved to try and rescue Kuma, who by then had been reduced to the most degrading fate imaginable at the hands of the nobles. It's the moment the revolution stopped whispering in the cracks and stood up in the front hall of the world and shouted. Sabo earned a title out of all that, the Flame Emperor, and his actions at the Reverie became a spark the way these things do, inspiring the oppressed across the world who'd been waiting for a sign that the untouchable could be touched. which is exactly the sort of thing Dragon has been building toward for his entire career. His finest pupil, the boy from the alley, standing in the enemy's own house and proving it could be done. I said at the start that Sabo's connection to Dragon and to Luffy was one of the quiet miracles of the plot, and I stand by that. Because strip away the powers and the titles and the arcs, and what you've got is this: a man who hated the nobility, saved a noble child, and raised him with more genuine care than the boy's real family ever showed him. And that boy grew up to be a brother, in every way that counts, to the son that same man couldn't bring himself to raise. Dragon fathered one boy from a distance, and raised another one up close, and the two turned out to be brothers, and none of them knew for years. There's something almost unbearably tender in that when you sit with it. The absent father was, without realizing it, family to his son's family the whole time. Now I've been dancing around the thing that made Dragon who he is for a while now. The event that turned a young man into the person willing to give up all of this, his own child included, for a mission this total. It happened a long time ago on an island that officially doesn't exist anymore. And we've only really been shown it properly very recently. So let's finally go there. Here's a thing that always slightly delights me about long-running stories. You can wait the better part of a lifetime for the answer to a character's biggest question, and then it turns out the answer was a young man on a beach being told to do something he knew was wrong and quietly deciding he wouldn't. Dragon started out as a marine. That surprised a lot of people when it was confirmed, though in hindsight it makes complete sense, given who his father is. He followed Garp into the Navy, as you might expect a hero's son to do. He trained, he learned the trade. He was, by every indication, on the path his father had laid out for him. And then as a young cadet of 17, he got shipped out to an island in the West Blue called God Valley, for what he was told was a training exercise. It was not a training exercise. God Valley is one of those names the story held back for years, dropping it once, mysteriously, in the mouth of an old admiral, and then letting it hang there as a legend before finally, recently, showing us what actually happened. The bones of the legend were about the pirates. It was the site of a colossal clash where Garp and the pirate king of all people temporarily joined forces to destroy the worst pirate crew of that era. That's the version the world half knew. Two titans of the age, briefly on the same side, wiping out a monstrous threat. A heroic story, if you squint. But that was never the whole of it, and the part that got left out is the part that made Dragon. Because the reason everyone was on that island in the first place was obscene. The celestial dragons had gathered there to hold a hunt, a game. They'd rounded up the island's own people and a mass of slaves, and they were hunting them for sport, putting scores on human heads, offering prizes, treating the slaughter of thousands of people as an afternoon's entertainment. And the Marines, the noble navy, the good guys, were there to facilitate it, to do the setup, to make the killing field ready for their masters. And a 17-year-old cadet was handed a weapon loaded with tranquilizer rounds and ordered to help round up innocent people so they could be hunted. You can see, can't you, why nothing small would ever satisfy this man afterward. He was made to do it. He was a cadet, he was surrounded, he had no power, and he was forced to fire on civilians, and the story shows him trying to tell himself they'd be all right, that they were only sedated, that he hadn't really done harm, which is the kind of thing you tell yourself when you've been made complicit in something you can't stop and can't yet escape. The whole sequence, when it finally arrived in the manga, was quietly devastating precisely because it wasn't dramatic. It was a young person discovering in real time that the institution he'd trusted was a tool in the hands of monsters, and that his own hands were being used. Then it got worse, and then, in the middle of the worst, he made the choices that defined the rest of his life. Amid all the horror, he came across a dying woman, a mother at the very end, who had 2 infant sons, twins, and who begged this young marine, this stranger, to save her children. And Dragon did. Or he tried to. He got one of the babies out. That baby was Shanks, the red-haired boy who would grow up to become one of the most important pirates in the entire world. The very man who would one day give a young Luffy a straw hat and set the whole story in motion. Dragon saved him on a beach as a nameless infant, while the world burned around them both. But he couldn't save them both. The other twin, Shamrock, he couldn't reach in time. Both children lived, and Dragon carried one of them out of that place, the one he saved and the one he lost. Sit with the weight of that for a second, because it's the kind of thing this story does so well. The man branded the world's worst criminal, the great enemy of the world order, personally saved the infant who would become the hinge of the entire golden age of piracy, and did it not knowing who the child was, not for any strategic reason, but because a dying woman asked him to, and he couldn't say no to that. That's who he is, underneath everything. That's the core the whole revolution is built around. And there's more, because that same day, on that same island, he did one other thing that mattered enormously without knowing it would. There was a boy there, a slave, being brutalized, about to be killed by a world noble for the noble's amusement. And Dragon turned his weapon on the celestial dragon. Put a noble down to save a captured child, which for a marine is more or less the most unthinkable thing you can do, an act of open rebellion against the untouchable class. He saved that boy and another young person near him, and here's the part that turns it into pure odour. The boy he saved was Kuma, the very man who would, decades later, become one of his closest friends and most trusted lieutenants. They both survived God Valley. They almost certainly had no idea at the time that their paths had crossed. Two of the founding pillars of the Revolutionary Army were on that beach together, one saving the other's life, and it would be the better part of a lifetime before either of them, or we, understood it. So that's the crucible. That's where the revolutionary was born. Not in a grand act of defiance, but in the slow horror of a young man realizing what he'd signed up to serve and choosing, in the middle of it, to save who he could. He learned that day that the Marines were not the good guys, that they were a puppet, an instrument in the hands of people who considered ordinary human life a game. And once you've seen that clearly, really seen it, you can't unsee it. The rest of his life is essentially the working out of that single realization. It wasn't the only blow either. There was another event, some years on, that the story points to as part of what finally pushed him out of the Navy for good. The destruction of O'Hara. The infamous incident where the world government wiped out an entire island of scholars, wiped out a whole library of the world's history, because those scholars had learned things they weren't permitted to know. The sheer brutality of that, an act of intellectual and human annihilation, carried out with the full sanction of the government, was the second great proof that the institution Dragon had served was beyond saving. God Valley showed him what they do to the powerless for sport. O'Hara showed him what they do to the knowledgeable, out of fear. Between the two, there was nothing left of his loyalty to salvage. So he left, walked away from the Navy, away from the path his father had set, and started quietly to build the thing that would eventually terrify the whole structure he'd turned his back on. There's a strange little coda to all this that I find weirdly moving. A little over 2 decades before our main story, at the execution of the Pirate King in Logue Town, Dragon was there in the crowd. We've seen him in that moment, and he's different. Younger, obviously, but more than that, he's still. Not grinning for once, no tattoo yet on his face. Just standing there, watching the Pirate King die and hearing the words that would spark the great age of piracy, and reacting with none of the wild emotion of the people around him. Just a quiet, watchful stillness. Whatever he'd already lived through by then, God of Valley, and everything after, it had made him into someone who could stand in that crowd, at that world-turning moment, and simply take it in. The storm hadn't started following him around yet, but the man who would build a revolution was already fully formed, standing in the rain, watching an era end and another begin. And the remarkable thing, the thing worth pausing on, is how far the ripples from that one young cadet's choices would eventually spread. Because saving a baby on a beach turns out not to be a small act at all. So let's follow those ripples for a bit. Here's the thought that keeps me up, in a good way, whenever I turn Dragon's story over in my head. One quiet man, one reluctant decision on a beach, and you can trace a line from it straight through to almost everything that matters in the entire series. It's the kind of causal chain that only really works in a story this long and this carefully built, where a writer can plant something in one decade and let it bloom in another. Start with the obvious one. Dragon saved a baby. That baby grew up to be Salbo. Shanks grew up to be one of the 4 great pirate emperors, one of the most respected and influential figures on the seas. And Shanks, at a certain point in his travels, spent time in a sleepy little village in the East Blue, where he met a stubborn, starry-eyed child who wanted more than anything to become a pirate. And Shanks gave that child his straw hat and told him to bring it back one day when he'd become a great pirate. That child was Luffy. That hat became the symbol of the entire story. The whole adventure, the crew, the dream, the 1,000+ episodes of it, all of it hangs off Shanks handing Luffy that hat. And Shanks was only alive to do that because, decades earlier, a horrified young Marine cadet got one of 2 babies off a burning beach because their dying mother asked him to. Let that settle for a moment, because it's rather lovely. Shanks is, in the most literal and traceable way, one of the reasons Luffy became a pirate. Not through anything he did as a father, because he did almost nothing as a father, but through a single act of mercy performed on a stranger's child, long before Luffy existed, that rippled forward across nearly 40 years to put a straw hat on a boy's head in a village Garp had left him in. The man who couldn't be a father to Luffy is nonetheless woven into the very origin of Luffy's dream, in a way neither of them knows about, and probably never will. And it doesn't stop with Shanks and the hat. Follow the other threads out from that same period, and they're everywhere. Kuma, the boy Dragon saved from a noble that day, went on to live a life of almost unimaginable sacrifice, and the kindnesses he performed, the people he quietly protected, the way he shielded the straw hats. At a crucial moment during the story, all of that was deeply shaped by his own convictions and experiences, including Dragon putting a celestial dragon down to save him. Every good thing Kuma ever did is in a sense downstream of that one moment. There's even a darker branch to the tree, the great clash on that island, the one that made the legend, ended one era of piracy and cleared the ground for another. And out of the wreckage of that day and the crew that was broken there came figures who would go on to shape the villainy of the present, including, in a roundabout way, the rise of the pirate who'd eventually destroy Dragon's own headquarters. The ripples don't only carry good things forward, they carry everything forward. That's how consequence works. You don't get to choose which of your actions echo. What I love about all this, though, is what it says about the shape of the story Oda is telling. This is a world where the official history is a lie, where the version everyone knows of God Valley, of the Void Century, of who the good guys are, has been carefully edited by the people in charge to keep themselves in charge. And underneath that official history runs a truer one, a hidden network of causes and connections that the powerful either don't know about or have worked hard to bury. And Dragon sits right at a major junction of that hidden history. The world thinks he's the worst criminal alive. The world has no idea that the same man is quietly one of the load-bearing walls of everything good that's happened in a generation. That gap between how he's branded and what he's actually done is the sort of irony this series runs on. The man the world government has decided is the ultimate threat to human decency is, on the evidence, one of the most decent people in the entire story. He saved children, he spared slaves, he pulled a drowning boy out of the sea and raised him with love. He built an organisation that helps the powerless. And for all of it, they've painted him as the devil. Meanwhile, the people doing the actual hunting of children for sport get to call themselves gods and live in a holy land at the top of the world. If you wanted a single image for what's wrong with this fictional world and what Dragon is fighting to fix, you could hardly do better than that contrast. And here's the part that I think is quietly the point of his whole character. Dragon almost never gets to see the good his actions do. He doesn't know Shanks became the man who'd inspire his son. He probably doesn't fully know how much Kuma's survival meant to the world. He operates in the dark, planting things, saving who he can, trusting that it adds up to something, without ever getting the satisfying payoff of watching it bloom. That's a hard way to live. Most of us need to see that our efforts land. Dragon has spent his whole life making moves whose consequences he'll never witness, on faith that they matter. There's something almost monastic about it, a revolutionary as a kind of gardener, planting trees whose shade he'll never sit in. I don't want to oversell it into something grander than it is, mind. He's not a saint. He handed his own child to someone else and walked away, and whatever his reasons, that's a real thing with real weight. And Luffy grew up without a father because of it. The story doesn't let him off the hook for that, and neither should we. But the picture that emerges when you lay the whole thing out is of a man who traded any hope of an ordinary, connected, present life for the chance to be a quiet hinge that the whole world turns on without knowing his name behind the wanted poster. Whether that trade was worth it is, I suspect, a question the final act of the story is going to make him actually confront, and I can't wait to see how he answers it. For now, though, having wandered through everything we do know, the man, the family, the storm at Logetown, the army, the friends, the boy in the alley, the beach that made him, and the ripples spreading out from all of it, it feels only right to spend some time in the other half of him. The unknown half. Because for everything we've pieced together tonight, the honest truth is that the biggest questions about Monkey D. Dragon are still completely open. So let's go and sit with those. I find there's something quietly relaxing about a good, unresolved mystery. Not the frightening kind where you need the answer. The comfortable kind where you can just turn the question over in your hands and enjoy the shape of it without any pressure to solve it. And Dragon is made almost entirely of those. So let's go through the big ones, slowly, and just appreciate how completely Oda has kept us in the dark. The biggest one, the one everyone asks first, is the simplest to state and the hardest to answer. What can he actually do? We have watched this man for the better part of a generation, and we have never, not once, seen him fight. Think about how strange that is. This is a series absolutely stuffed with spectacular combat. Every major character, and most of the minor ones, has had their powers laid out in loving, detailed, page-filling clarity. And the leader of the revolutionary army, a man positioned as one of the most important figures in the endgame, has never thrown a confirmed punch on screen. We don't know if he has a devil fruit. We know his fighting style includes Ryosoken, Fishman, Karate, and Haki. We know he possesses Haki, including Conqueror's Haki. We know several of his combat abilities, though much remains mysterious, and people in the world regard him as extremely powerful. It's all reputation and no demonstration. And Oda has held that line with real discipline for decades, which tells you he's saving it. You don't keep a card face down that long, unless you're planning to slam it on the table at exactly the right moment. Then there's the weather. We touched on the storm at Logetown earlier, and the deliberate haziness about whether he caused it. But Logetown wasn't a one-off this, there's a pattern. Just about every single time Dragon has appeared outdoors, across the whole series, there's been a storm or a strange wind or weather doing something it probably shouldn't. When he saved the people of the Goa kingdom from a wall of fire, there was a great wind that cut a tunnel through the flames. When he rescued Sabo from the sea, in the anime version, he more or less arrives on a gust that comes from nowhere. Outdoors near Dragon, the air is almost always up to something. He himself has this habit, this lovely little character Tick, of talking about staying in the wind, of walking out to be in the weather when he wants to think, of always turning to look toward the east blue when the wind changes direction. The story has quietly, insistently associated this man with moving air for its entire run. Whether that's a devil fruit power, some weather controlling ability, or just a recurring bit of visual mood that follows him around, we do not know. It's never been confirmed, and I want to be really clear that this next bit is fan theory, not fact, because it's a fun one and I don't want to present it as more than it is. There's a popular idea that Dragon's power might be a mythical creature fruit, a thunderbird sort of thing, tied to the tattoo on his face. The reasoning goes that his facial markings resemble the iconography of certain real-world traditions that revered a great storm bird, a creature said to summon thunder and stir up weather with its wings and eyes. And you look at that, and you look at the lifetime of storms trailing after him, and you look at the tattoo he chose to put on his face at some point in his past, and the theory starts to feel almost too neat. But neat is not the same as confirmed. It's a guess, a good guess, a satisfying guess, but a guess. Oda has told us precisely nothing, and half the fun is that he's told us nothing. His bounty, we've mentioned, is another blank. Just the word unknown where a number should be, for the world's worst criminal. I said earlier that the absence of a figure does more work than any figure could, and I stand by it. Most other major threats in the world have a number attached, a price, a way of ranking them against each other. Dragon has a hole. The government has effectively declined to price him, or has decided the number is not for public consumption, and either way, the effect is the same. He exists slightly outside the system the story uses to measure everyone else. Even in how he's catalogued, he's the exception. Then there's the letter, which I promised we'd come back to. The D, the will of D. We know Dragon is a D. We know his father Garp is a D. So it runs in the family blood, and we know his son is a D. And we know that this initial, scattered across the generations and across the world, is treated by those few who understand it as something enormous, something ancient, something the world government fears so deeply that even saying too much about it seems to be dangerous. The people who carry it tend to laugh in the face of death, tend to love freedom to a fault, tend to end up standing against the powerful. The full meaning of it, what a D actually is, where the line comes from, what it's meant to do, is one of the very oldest and best kept secrets in the entire story, tangled up with the hidden history of the world and the mystery of the great treasure itself. And Dragon is a D who has spent his whole life fighting the exact system that seems to have buried the meaning of his own name. Whether he knows what it means, whether the revolution is partly about uncovering it, we don't know, but it's hard to believe it's a coincidence that the man leading the war against the world order carries the letter the world order is most afraid of. A slightly newer thread, and a tantalising one, is his connection to Vegapunk, the great scientist. When the two of them spoke recently in the story, it came out that they'd known each other for a very long time, more than 2 decades, which opens up a whole quiet history we've never been shown. What were the world's most dangerous revolutionary and the world's most brilliant scientist doing in each other's lives all those years ago? What did they share? What did they build? What do they know between them? It's another door the story has opened just a crack, letting a little light through before moving on. And given how much Vegapunk turned out to know about the true state of the world, the fact that he and Dragon go back that far feels like it matters. We just don't know how yet. And then there's the shape of the present, which has started to press on Dragon in a way it hasn't before. Recently, the world got a horrifying demonstration of the true power sitting at the very top of it, when an entire kingdom, Lulusia, was simply erased, wiped off the map by a force nobody was supposed to know existed, wielded by a ruler most of the world doesn't even know is there. And Dragon, who has spent his whole life fighting the world government, found himself confronting the possibility that the thing he's up against is even larger and stranger than he'd understood. In the aftermath, he was notably shaken and notably urgent. He'd apparently spent his life hating war, of all things, this man who leads an army, and now he was warning his people that the world was tipping toward a period where people would be fighting simply to find somewhere safe to exist, that the chaos was coming faster than expected and they had to move. It's a rare thing to see Dragon rattled. He spends most of the story as the calmest man in any room, and the fact that recent events have got under even his guard tells you the story is finally accelerating toward the confrontation he's been predicting for years. What I find quietly wonderful about all these open questions, taken together, is that they're not loose ends. They're a deliberately unfinished portrait. Oda has spent decades showing us exactly enough of Dragon to make us care, and not one detail more, because this is a man being saved for the end. The blank bounty, the hidden powers, the mystery of the D, the storms, the long-buried history with Vegapunk, all of it is Oda keeping his most important pieces in reserve. And honestly, I hope he takes his time even now. There's a particular pleasure in a character who stays a question mark this long, and I'm in no rush at all for the answers. Content, for now, to leave him standing in the dark he walked out of. Since we're on the subject of what makes Dragon Dragon, I want to spend a little while just on his manner. Not the plot, not the powers, just the way he moves through the world, because it's one of the most distinctive things about him, and it's built out of tiny details rather than big moments. The first thing is the calm. Dragon is, almost without exception, the stillest person in any scene he's in. Everyone around him tends to be reacting, arguing, panicking, celebrating, and he's just there, watching, with that faint grin, taking it all in. When his soldiers bring him urgent news, he doesn't leap up. When he learns things that would send most people into a spin, he tends to go quiet and walk outside. There's a groundedness to him that's quite unusual for a character with a goal this enormous. You'd expect a man trying to overthrow the entire world order to be a bundle of intensity. Instead, he's more like a very patient chess player who's already seen how the game ends and is simply waiting for the board to catch up. Then there's the way he talks, which is properly strange, and I mean that affectionately. Dragon speaks like a mystic half the time. He comes out with these lines about fate, about the nature of the world, about the wind, that sound less like a military commander and more like some kind of weather-worn oracle. He'll say he's going to go and stay in the wind for a while and just walk out onto a balcony. He talks about the true nature of the world being revealed. He has this recurring, almost ritual habit of turning to look toward the east blue whenever the wind shifts, as though he's listening for something out there that the rest of us can't hear. And the east blue, of course, is where he left his son. So you can read that gesture two ways at once, as the affectation of a man who thinks in grand cosmic terms, and as the small private tell of a father whose attention keeps drifting home, no matter how far his mission takes him. I suspect it's both, the mystic and the dad, wrapped up in the same tilt of the head toward the horizon. He also, notably, does not like talking about his past. Ask him about it and he closes up, deflects, changes the subject, which, given what we now know his past contains, is entirely understandable. When the thing that made you is a mystery, you're probably not keen on reminiscing. but it means that for most of the series, the reticence itself was a clue. A man this closed about his own history is a man whose history is worth being closed about. The silence was a signpost. Here's the contradiction in him that I find most interesting, though. Dragon leads an army. He spent his life preparing for a great war, and yet, from what we've seen, he hates war, truly dislikes it. He's not a man who relishes conflict or glories in battle, the way plenty of characters in this world do. He seems to regard the coming war as a grim necessity, a terrible thing that has to happen, because the alternative is worse rather than something he wants. And there's something quite profound in that. A reluctant warlord, a man who'd clearly rather the world were simply better, so that none of this were necessary, but who has looked at how the world actually is and concluded that it won't get better on its own, and that someone has to be willing to break it open. He carries the whole weight of that without any apparent appetite for the violence it'll require. That's a hard thing to hold, and I think it's part of why he's always looking off at the wind. It's a heavy way to live. His relationship with his own homeland is another telling thread. Dragon was born in the Goa kingdom, the same place he'd later saved from that fire, the same place Sabo came from, and Dragon has no love for it. He regards the corruption of Goa, the way the powerful there treat the poor, as rubbish to be swept away, as the whole rotten world in miniature. It's not a place he's sentimental about. If anything, it seems to be one of the early sources of his disgust, a childhood spent watching, up close, the small-scale version of the injustice he'd later fight on a global scale. There's a sort of grim symmetry to the fact that the man who wants to burn down the world, Order, was born in one of its more corrupt little corners and grew up seeing exactly how it worked. He didn't come to his revolution from theory, he came to it from home. And underneath all of it, holding the whole strange package together, is that persistent, unreadable grin. Even at his most serious, even when the news is terrible, there's usually that faint smile. It's not warmth exactly, and it's not cruelty. I've come to read it as a kind of grim certainty, the look of a man who decided a long time ago what he was going to do with his life, and has never once wavered, and finds a dark sort of peace in that. He knows the war is coming. He's known for years, and rather than dread it, he seems to have made his peace with being the person who'll have to be there when it does. That's what the grin is, I think. Not happiness. Resolve, worn so long it's set into the face like an old habit. Put it all together, and you get one of the more quietly compelling character portraits in the whole series, drawn almost entirely in small strokes. A still, patient, mystic-tongued man who hates the very war he spent his life preparing, who won't discuss the past that shaped him, who keeps glancing home toward a son he left behind, and who wears a grin that's really just resolve. We've barely seen him do anything, and yet he feels utterly specific. That's the craft of it. Oda built a whole person out of stillness and weather, and a handful of cryptic lines. Now all of that is the dragon of the main story, the one on the page. But he does exist in a few other forms, out in the wider world of adaptations and side material, and some of it's rather charming. So let's have a gentle wander through Dragon off the page before we wind down. One of the funniest facts about Dragon to me is how rarely he turns up in all the spin-off material, and how, when he does, it's often just to blow people over with wind and then leave. He's this towering figure in the main story, and something of a ghost everywhere else, which feels weirdly appropriate for a character built on absence. Take the video games. One Piece has produced an absolute mountain of games over the years, and the roster of playable characters across them is enormous, packed with fighters major and minor, heroes and villains and one-scene wonders. And Dragon is, for the most part, simply not in them. For a long stretch, he barely featured as a character in the games at all, which is remarkable when you consider how central he is. When he has shown up, it's tended to be as a support character rather than a fighter you actually control, someone who appears to lend a hand and then vanishes. In one of the older brawler-style games, he turns up to help his side by, of course, blowing the opposition away with a gust of wind, which is both a nod to the whole storm mystery and a neat little dodge, because it lets him do something dramatic without ever committing to what his actual powers are. Even the games are in on the bit. Nobody's allowed to show you what Dragon can really do. Not even the tie-in merchandise. His absence from that world is so notable that it's become a running observation among fans. The most important man the story keeps off-screen also gets kept off-screen by the games, the toys, the whole apparatus of a massive franchise, presumably because the people making all that can't show what hasn't been revealed yet. His mystery is protected at every level. It's not just Oda holding the card back in the manga. The whole machine has been instructed, in effect, to leave the card face down. Then there's the animated side material, which has been a bit more generous. There's a special piece of the story, sometimes called Chapter 0, which was adapted into an animated short tied to one of the films. And it takes us back to that world-turning day of the Pirate King's execution. And there in the crowd is Dragon, young, watchful still. It was one of the earlier proper looks we got at him in his past, confirming he'd been present at that pivotal moment, standing among the masses as the age of piracy was born. Small appearance, but a meaningful one, because it started to sketch in the idea that this man had quietly been present at the hinge points of history all along. The live-action adaptation is the newest wrinkle, and it's handled Dragon with real care, which I appreciated. In the first season's climax at Logetown, he appears just as he does in the source, the hooded figure in the storm who saves Luffy at the execution and confronts the Marines in the wind and rain. They kept the mystery intact, gave you the silhouette and the impossible weather and the cryptic presence without over-explaining any of it. And in the second season, the wider world starts talking about the Dragon, this revolutionary whose influence is growing, who represents a real and rising threat to the world's rulers, and they show his face in that context, tying the mysterious saviour from Logetown to the name that has kings worried. There was even a little detail in the live-action version, a second mysterious figure standing near him, hinting at allies waiting in the wings, which is exactly the sort of thing that gets fans happily speculating. They understood that the right way to adapt Dragon is to keep him a question, show enough to intrigue, never enough to satisfy. On the trivia side, there are a couple of things I find quietly delightful. In the Japanese version, he's voiced by a veteran actor with a deep, dignified, weathered sort of voice. The kind of voice that suits a man who talks about the wind and fate, and the casting has been widely praised as a perfect fit for the character's gravitas. And then, on the other end of the scale, there's his showing in the fan popularity polls, which is quietly funny. In one of the big character popularity votes, Dragon landed somewhere down in the 80s. This pivotal, endgame critical, world-shaking figure ranked below dozens of comparatively minor characters. And honestly, that makes complete sense when you think about it. Popularity polls reward characters people have spent time with, characters who've had arcs and jokes and emotional moments and fights. Dragon has had almost none of that. You can't love a character you've barely met. He ranks low precisely because Oda has kept him at arm's length, which means his pole position is, in a roundabout way, a measure of how well the mystery has been maintained. The very thing that makes him fascinating on a structural level makes him hard to vote for on an emotional one. I find that a rather lovely little paradox to sit with. What all of this adds up to, across the games and the specials and the live action and the polls, is a picture of a character whose defining trait, his mystery, has been protected so thoroughly that it's shaped even how he exists outside the main story. He's the man who isn't in the games, the face they only show you in flashback, the silhouette in the storm, the important name people whisper without ever quite seeing the man behind it. Even the merchandise treats him like a rumour, and there's something fitting about that, something that tells you the whole enterprise understands what it has in him. You don't put a mystery on a lunchbox, you keep it in reserve and you let the wondering do the work. Which, after all this wandering, is more or less where we started. A man in a green cloak, glimpsed in a storm, standing slightly apart from everything, waiting for a story that hasn't finished telling itself yet. There's one more thing I want to do before we close though. Here's a small thing that struck me while pulling all of this together, and it's the sort of thing you only notice when you lay a character's whole history out end to end. You can count the number of times we've actually seen Dragon on your fingers. For a character this important, across this many years of story, his total screen presence is tiny. So I thought it'd be a nice, quiet way to wind down, just walking through the handful of glimpses we've been given, like flicking slowly through a very short photo album. The earliest, chronologically, is the one we've already touched on. The young man in the crowd at the Pirate King's execution, still and watchful while the world changed around him. That's glimpse one. A face in a sea of faces, decades before we'd learn his name, present at the birth of the age of pirates and giving almost nothing away. Then, from the point of view of the story's actual running order, the first proper sighting is Loguetown. The storm, the rescue, the words to a son who couldn't hear him, the question to the marine captain about why anyone would stop a man setting sail. We've been over it, so I won't linger, but after that enormous series-defining moment, he more or less disappears again, for a very long stretch. That's the pattern with him. A brief, electric appearance, and then nothing for ages. The next real look comes much later, at the old headquarters on that grey, windswept island, and it's one of my favourite little dragon moments, precisely because so little happens in it. He's standing there looking at Luffy's latest bounty poster, quietly proud in his understated way, and one of his soldiers starts to tell him something, starts to mention that this rookie causing all the fuss is actually the grandson of the great marine hero. And Dragon just leaves, cuts the man off, turns away, says he's going to go and stay in the wind for a while, and walks out onto the balcony. He didn't want to hear it said out loud. He already knew, of course, but there's something so telling in that small refusal. A man who keeps even his own most personal truth at arm's length, who'd rather go and stand in the weather than sit in a room where the fact of his son is being spoken. Then he stands out there and remarks, half to himself, that the true nature of the world will be answered soon, and that he'll meet Luffy again. And that's the whole scene. Barely anything, and yet it tells you volumes. Around the Great War and its aftermath, we get another handful of glimpses, and they're mostly about him reading the shifting shape of the world. When the era's greatest pirate falls and the balance of power lurches, Dragon takes note, tells his people that the world's equilibrium is beginning to tip, that they'll soon need to gather the revolutionary leaders scattered across the globe. He's not reacting to events so much as reading them, like a man watching the barometer drop and knowing what it means before the storm arrives. And after another of the world's major powers is brought down elsewhere, he receives reports that rebel movements are succeeding all across the world, one after another, the seeds his people planted finally flowering at once. You can imagine the quiet satisfaction in that, a lifetime of patient work starting, at last, to pay off. Then there's the planning around the great gathering of kings, where he and Sabo sit and map out the boldest move the army had ever attempted, the decision to strike right at the heart of the enemy. We've talked about what came of that, so I'll just note the image of the two of them, mentor and pupil, commander and second, sitting together and deciding to change the world. And later still, the relocation, the whole Operation shifting its base after the loss of the old one, gathering its commanders in their new home to prepare for what's coming. And the most recent glimpses are the ones that feel like the story finally turning to face him properly. The phone call with the great scientist, revealing a friendship decades old that we'd never suspected. The aftermath of a kingdom being erased from existence, and Dragon, for once, rattled, urging his people that the world is tipping toward chaos faster than any of them expected. These recent sightings feel different in weight from the old ones. The early glimpses were a mystery being teased. These feel like a character being moved, deliberately, into position for whatever the ending holds. And that's more or less the album. A face at an execution, a silhouette in a storm, a man refusing to hear his son named, a commander reading the weather of the world, a mentor planning a raid, an old friend on the phone, and a rattled revolutionary sensing the end approaching. Laid out like that, it's remarkable how little there is, and how much each fragment carries. Most characters get hours of screen time. Dragon gets moments, and every one of them is loaded. It's the storytelling equivalent of a very expensive perfume, used one drop at a time. You never get much. You never need much, and you remember every single time. There's a real discipline in that on Oda's part that I keep coming back to. It would have been so easy to give us more Dragon, to cash in the mystery early, to let him fight or explain himself, or step into the light. And instead we've been given this careful trickle, drop by drop, decade by decade, so that even now, after everything, the album's still thin and the man's still mostly shadow. Which means whatever's coming still has the full weight of decades of restraint behind it. That's a lot of pressure built up behind a very small door. So that's Monkey D. Dragon, or rather, that's everything we've been allowed to know about him, which turns out to be a strange, lopsided sort of portrait. We know the beach that made him and almost nothing about the powers he'd use. We know who he saved, and almost nothing about who he is when nobody's watching. We know he's a father, and we've barely seen him be one. He's the most thoroughly sketched out blank in the whole series, and I think, after spending all this time with him, that's exactly how I like him. When I put the whole thing together in my head, the image I keep landing on is the simplest one. A tall man in a green coat, standing on a windswept balcony somewhere, reading the world's news, and then setting it down and walking outside to be in the weather for a while, turning, without quite meaning to look east. Toward the small blue sea, where he left a baby with his own estranged father, and walked away to go and try to save the world instead. That gesture, that little tilt of the head toward home, is the whole man for me. The revolutionary and the father, the mystic and the estranged son, all folded into one quiet look at a horizon. Because here's the thing that stays with me. Dragon has given up almost everything a person could give up. A normal life, a place to belong, the chance to raise his own child, or even really to know him. Any hope of seeing most of his own good works bloom. He traded all of it for a mission so enormous that its success would mean the end of the world as this story knows it. And he's pursued that mission for decades with a patience that borders on the inhuman, mostly in silence, mostly in the dark, mostly alone at the top of it. And he's done it, as far as we can tell, not out of hatred, not out of ambition, but because a long time ago, as a young man, he was made to see something so wrong that he could never again pretend not to have seen it. He saw hunted people on a beach. He saw a government that called itself divine, treating human beings as sport. And he decided quietly that he would spend the rest of his life making sure that ended, whatever it cost him personally. And it has cost him. It's cost him nearly everything a person values. He just decided the cost was worth paying. There's a kind of loneliness in that, which the story has never quite spelled out, but which sits under every scene he's in. The stillness, the weather following him around. The way he keeps to himself, the reluctance to talk about the past, the grin that's really just resolve worn smooth. This is a man who's been carrying something heavy for a very long time, on his own, by choice, and who has made his peace with carrying it right up until the end. Whatever the end turns out to be. And it is coming, that end. That's the other thing to hold on to as we wind down here. For most of the series, Dragon has felt like a promise the story wasn't ready to keep yet, a piece kept in reserve, a name spoken more than a man seen. But the story is finally moving toward the confrontation he spent his whole life predicting. The great war he keeps warning his people about is gathering. The powers at the very top of the world have started to show themselves. The pieces Oda has been holding back for decades, the powers, the bounty, the truth of the D, the buried history, are the sort of pieces you only hold back because you're saving them for the finale. And Dragon is going to be right in the middle of it when it comes. The man who has watched from the wings all this time is, I suspect, about to walk out onto the stage. And I can't wait to see it whenever it arrives, in no hurry, the way the best things come. I think that's what I find most comforting about him in the end, and it's a slightly odd thing to find comforting. Dragon is proof that a story can hold something back for the length of a lifetime, and trust you to keep caring about it in the meantime. In a world of stories that rush to explain everything, that lay all their cards on the table in the first hour so nobody gets impatient, here's a character who stayed a genuine question for as long as the series has existed, protected by a writer patient enough to wait, and an audience patient enough to wonder. There's a kind of faith in that, faith that the wondering is worth something on its own, that not knowing can be a pleasure rather than a frustration, and whether or not the eventual answers live up to all that restraint, and I suspect they will, the waiting itself has already been its own quiet reward. A man in a green coat, unexplained, standing in the weather, mattering enormously for reasons we can feel but can't yet see. That's a lovely thing to have carried around for this long. For now, though, it's enough to have wandered through what we've got. A grinning man in a green cloak, glimpsed in storms, who saved a child that grew into a legend, who raised a drowning boy into a hero, who left his own son a straw hat's worth of destiny without ever meaning to, and who stands even now at the edge of everything, looking east waiting for the wind to change. The rest of his story is still out there, unwritten, somewhere past the horizon he keeps watching. It'll wait for us. Sleep well.